At the beginning of approaching this collection was like, how do we kind of reset it, kind of strip back? When the pandemic hit, it's just, all right, let's now kind of take everything we've been feeling and really kind of act on it. The title of the collection is Kiss, Keep It Simple, Stupid. Once the pandemic hit, everything just kind of felt so overwhelming. So I was like, let's just keep this as simple as possible and focused. I feel like that DIY approach to creation is just so rooted, I think, in youth culture. And so that's also why I want to keep this kind of hand-touched element in the collections.
Today we're shooting in a youth theater and we're utilizing the stuff that's already here, kind of bits of sets. I think there's something really cool about being able to find a ready-made.
I just kind of love the kind of appearance that pieces kind of take on through normal wear and tear of work. When you walk out of your home as a designer, how could you not be inspired by the people around you?
I'm into streetwear and techwear, so these are like my favorite type of clothes.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are trying to move away from the idea of fast fashion and stuff, and I think this definitely fits in with that. You can rework your own clothes.
Me gusta todo, you know?
I think what I'm able to really explore is these possibilities. Learning from like the heart of people who do it best. Designing that into the collections, I think is kind of almost like this layer of confidence for the wearer, not to be so precious when they're wearing my clothes. They become much more beautiful over time.
Growing up in San Francisco defined me where like Nike and Jordan, right? Those were my heroes at the time. Again, being an athlete, I was always kind of, you know, in Nike and Jordan. And so eventually getting older, going into, you know, middle school, high school, I remember wearing brands like Tommy Hilfiger and like FUBU. So I really believe that, you know, before I was really into, or I even had discovered what streetwear is, you know, how it is today, it was really kind of like looking at like Tommy Hilfiger and like FUBU. Like those were my brands. Graphics, you know, numbers. Again, those brands were also, I think, kind of really inspired by sports. You look at a lot of like the FUBU jerseys, like the football jerseys, and, you know, Tommy Hilfiger looking at like, you know, all types of like American sports. And, you know, Polo Ralph Lauren looking at polo, you know? And so a lot of these brands were inspired by sports. The very first store I actually, you know, got a job at was on Haight Street in San Francisco. And Haight Street was like downtown New York of San Francisco. We had Stussy.
But that was all right, because there were other opportunities taking shape behind the scenes. In 2015, Kanye set the internet ablaze by announcing that he would be leaving Nike for Adidas. Nike Yeezys have been wildly successful and are still today some of the most coveted sneakers of all time, but due to a series of creative differences, tensions grew between Nike and Kanye until the relationship had been irreparably damaged. Adidas promised to give him the creative freedom that Nike had promised him, so in his mind, the choice was easy. It was a done deal. Kanye was going to Adidas, and he wanted to bring Heron with him. As Heron remembers it, he used to take calls with Kanye about moving to Adidas while sitting in the cafeteria of the Nike office, and he would sit way off in the corner so that no one could hear him. Nike didn't need to hear him to know that something was up. They didn't even need to know about the potential move to Adidas. They had just noticed that he was spending a ton of his time and energy on things other than Nike, such as going on tour with Kanye and launching Ben Trill. As a result, they issued him an ultimatum. Either move to the Portland office, or he was fired. The idea here was that making him leave New York would help him become more focused on his job, or at least that was his suspicion. But whatever the case may be, his answer was no. Sure, Nike was his main source of income, but wasn't going to let the fear of losing that income stop him from chasing his dream. And he didn't. That was the end of his tenure with Nike. Heron did end up going to work for Kanye as a creative consultant for Yeezy season. This was more like a part-time consulting job than it was a full-time job. That meant he had some free time on his hands, and he's not the type to just sit around. His mind is always jumping to new creative endeavors, and this time, it was jumping back to his days as a high schooler making screen-printed t-shirts. Rather than launching a brand, he started doing one-off releases that he himself admits were basically bootlegs. For instance, he designed a pair of Air Force Ones that, instead of the iconic Nike check, featured a Bapesta logo made out of Gucci fabric. He also reimagined Givenchy's Rottweiler tee, which is ironic knowing that his friend Matthew Williams would one day go on to become the creative director of Givenchy. He also made a NASCAR tee that featured the logos of several major companies, and this one went absolutely viral online. Like I said, these were all one-off releases, and that was intentional because he didn't want to start a brand just for it to get shut down. But these pieces helped put his name on the map as a designer. Needless to say, Heron was really beginning to hit his stride. Around this same time, he went from being a creative consultant for Yeezy Season to being an integral part of Kanye's creative imprint Donda. And there, he took a lead role in designing merch for the Life of Pablo. To this day, the Life of Pablo merch remains some of the most iconic and influential tour merch of all time, and Heron played a very important part in that. Nevertheless, he kept looking for his next big idea. He knew he couldn't keep doing these so-called bootlegs. He wanted to do something that would last. And as is often the case, that next big idea came to him when he least expected it. While on a trip to Ibiza, Heron was swimming at the beach. The sun was out, the water was perfect, everything was picturesque. Then, to his surprise, a plastic bag brushed up against his hand. That's when he stopped and realized that this beach that he thought was so beautiful was actually littered with trash, and he felt the need to do something about it. Also, as an aside, it says a lot about Heron's work ethic that even when he's on a vacation, he's thinking about his next project. This plastic bag reminded him a bit of the place he called home, New York City, because as those of you who have been there can attest, it is incredibly beautiful, but at the same time, littered with trash. So just like that, he began thinking about ways that he could get involved. And then the idea hit him. In New York City, the most powerful force keeping littering off the streets is the New York City Department of Sanitation, or as they're more commonly known, the DSNY. Heron's idea was to make them more fashionable, and at first you might be wondering, how in the world would that help? In hindsight, it was actually a brilliant strategy. See, he reached out to the department and asked if he could redesign their employee uniforms by upcycling old uniforms. These flashy new uniforms would draw attention to the employees out on the streets picking up trash, and that in turn would draw more attention to the importance of what they were doing. In other words, he was making the Department of Sanitation cool to make it seem like preventing litter was cool, which it is. All around, this was a great idea for a marketing campaign, and the Department of Sanitation was fully on board. Not only did they give Heron the funding to design and produce these new uniforms, but they allowed him to host a one-night release party/fashion show in the Spring Street salt shed right off of the West Side Highway. Some of you may have seen this building before, and it's actually really cool. Despite looking like a museum on the outside, the inside is filled with thousands of pounds of salt that the city uses to coat the roads before a big snowstorm. It's certainly an unconventional venue, one that's normally off limits to the public, but I mean it when I say that this is one of my favorite fashion show venues ever. It's just so original, it's so New York, and it was perfectly conducive to the purpose of this collection. Anyways, the collection ended up being a major success, selling out almost immediately, and beyond that, it caught the attention of some people in very high places. See, back in 2016, when this collection was released, the fashion industry was more focused on sustainability than it had ever been before. One of the biggest proponents of sustainability happened to be Vogue, so when they caught wind of what Heron and the DSNY were doing, they knew they had to cover it. This marked the first time ever that the Department of Sanitation had been featured in Vogue, and at a later awards ceremony, Vogue's editor-in-chief, Anna Wintour, even mentioned Heron by name when talking about some of the great steps that the fashion industry was taking towards sustainable practices. So clearly this whole thing was a major success, but I want to make clear that this was also a turning point in Heron's career. Up until this point, he'd been lending much of his talent out to other people. He was lending his marketing skills to Nike, he was lending his design skills to Kanye, and although he had done a few one-off releases of his own, as well as a few with Bentrill, there was nothing he could really point to and definitively claim as his. This collection, sure, he was working with the Department of Sanitation, but it was the Department of Sanitation in collaboration with Heron Preston. He was the driving force behind it, and as evidenced by Anna Wintour's praise, he was the one getting recognized for it. The reason that this was so important is because it gave him the momentum to go and start something of his own. I'm sure he could have done so earlier if he had wanted to, but the success of this collab was his proof of concept. That said, it was in 2017 that Heron officially decided to launch his own eponymous label. To him, this was a big deal, but to Virgil, it wasn't big enough. Allow me to explain. When he was first starting out, Heron thought it might be a good idea to test the water by releasing some hats. When he ran this idea by Virgil was adamant that he go ahead and release a full collection. See, Virgil's brand, Off-White, had already exploded in popularity at this point. It was by far one of the hottest things in fashion, let alone streetwear. So clearly he knew what he was talking about, but more importantly, Heron trusted Virgil's opinion as a friend. And being the good friend that he was, Virgil wasn't just going to tell Heron what to do. He was going to help him do it. For context, Off-White had recently, seeing that an agreement like this could possibly benefit Heron as well, Virgil set up a meeting between him and the New Guards Group. Note that it's pretty rare for companies like the New Guards Group to take meetings with brands that technically haven't released a single collection. As it turns out, they were familiar with his DSNY collaboration, and Virgil's praise carries a lot of weight. So they agreed to meet with him, and that is how Heron signed a deal with the New Guards Group. With their help, he launched his first official collection under the Heron Preston label. Presented in Paris, the collection established many of the signature design elements that would define the label in years to come. That included a focus on the color orange, bold graphics, camo, and perhaps most notably, a refined workwear aesthetic that almost made the collection feel like a continuation of his DSNY collaboration. But of course, it wasn't. Instead, this collection explained why that collaboration had been such a success. His ability to fuse workwear and more generally functional wear with a fresh streetwear-inspired aesthetic is what sets him apart as a designer. He can take an ordinary piece of clothing and with one small tweak turn it into something amazing. Case in point, one of the most popular pieces from this collection was the Cyrillic print crew neck. In case you aren't familiar, the Cyrillic alphabet is the alphabet used in the Russian language, and the word you see on the crew neck is the Russian word for style. To be clear, this wasn't some deep political message. He sort of just thought that it looked cool, and the decision was bolstered by a recommendation from the New Guards Group to try marketing his brand towards Russians. See, they'd picked up on the fact that young Russians had a growing interest in streetwear, but that they didn't yet have a streetwear brand of their own. Put simply, there was a gap in the market that Heron could fill, and so he did. He released this crew neck, held a pop-up in Russia's capital, Moscow, and even released t-shirts of Putin's face that spelled out Mr. President in rhinestones. For a brand that wasn't trying to send a political message, the clear focus on Russia here was interesting. But again, I think it was more about marketing than anything else. And although Putin had already been controversial for quite some time, it's worth noting that this was years before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So anyways, moving on, Heron continued refining his design language in subsequent collections. He'd rely on a lot of the same principles, but would apply them in new and unique ways. There
was another store called Red 5, which was like Colette, Paris. There was True, which was our sneaker shop. There was FTC, which was our skateboard location. Like that was our door, FTC for San Francisco. So it was that whole little neighborhood, that's where I was working. We were all these kids working retail, super, obsessed with style. I grew up skateboarding, as I mentioned earlier, and so, just skate style was just my thing. Skaters were kind of becoming my hero. It kind of went from like Michael Jordan to like Stevie Williams, Kareem Campbell, and like looking at, African-American skaters, because at the time it was predominantly white, and so I was like, these are my heroes. I want to dress like them. I want to skate like them. So that was my life. That was my world. It was skateboarding. And, within that whole world, the fashion looked like screen printed t-shirts and hoodies. That's really what it was. It was like Stussy, it was Massimo, Billabong. But then, mixing in again some of that Nike, some of that Jordan, and kind of mixing all of these different kind of worlds that raised me. That is kind of how I defined kind of like streetwear back when I was in San Francisco. And then, hip hop was also a huge influence of mine, and I was obsessed with New York City at the time. So I was obsessed with, like, from films, music, Cameron, Dipset, 50 Cent. This was like Who Kid era of like mixtapes, when you would have like 30 songs on a tape and every song was just like 1 minute long. And so looking at like Dipset and like Cameron inspired me to start wearing pink. And like Ye was like wearing polo, and like, so like all of these kind of influences from like sport and skateboarding and then like hip hop and like New York really kind of influence, I think, how I define myself through fashion. When I first moved to New York, 2004, super curious kid, just wanted to kind of soak up all of what New York had to offer. Didn't really know much about the city from what I had seen on movies, so I was just going out a lot and absorbing culture. And obviously New York Fashion Week, I didn't have that in San Francisco, so I was like, wow, Fashion Week, what is that? Sneaking into shows, I think one of the first shows I snuck into was like a Y3 show. Like all my friends were there. I remember this is when like Lupe Fiasco had that song like Kick Push Out, and he was at the show like sitting right behind me. So you kind of to see like this face kind of changing within.
In 1983, Heron Preston Johnson was born in California's Bay Area. First thing to address here is his name, because as you heard me say, his full name is Heron Preston Johnson. Professionally, he's known as Heron Preston, so that's how I'll be referring to him from here on in. When he was old enough, his father enrolled him in the New Technology High School in Napa, California. This was significant because New Tech was not just some ordinary high school. It was a modern, tech-focused high school that was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In a later interview with Elle magazine, Heron reflected on this experience, saying it felt a bit like a science experiment. Classrooms had glass walls, and swarms of business people, presumably tech entrepreneurs and philanthropists, would routinely walk the halls and watch in on them while they worked. In his classes, Heron learned valuable skills such as coding, but the one that changed everything for him was his new media class, where he learned to use design software like Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator. Right away, he was hooked. Some important context here is that, like many teenagers in California during the 1990s, Heron had also become hooked on skate culture. More specifically, he had become hooked on the aesthetic of skate culture. Thanks to the explosion of skatewear brands like Stussy and eventually Supreme, skaters everywhere began respecting graphic tees as their own art form. So when Heron began taking this new media class, he realized that he could begin designing his own graphic tees. And that's exactly what he did. One of his friends knew how to screen print these designs onto t-shirts, and so the two of them began designing, printing, and selling their shirts. As I'm sure you can imagine, this was a small-time operation, but for Heron, it was eye-opening. He now had the power to take an idea and turn it into a reality. After that, there was no turning back. In 2004, after graduating from high school, Heron enrolled at Parsons School of Design in New York City. He was set on pursuing a career in fashion, and there was no better place for him to be. Parsons is widely regarded as one of the best design schools in the US, if not the entire world, and is the alma mater of several iconic designers, including Marc Jacobs, Donna Karan, and Tom Ford, just to name a few. While he was ecstatic to be attending such a prestigious school, Heron still needed a creative outlet other than the classroom. So with the help of those coding skills he had learned in high school, he decided to launch his own blog. The purpose of this blog was to showcase his photography. You see, during his free time, he enjoyed exploring the city and photographing people he thought were stylish, which almost always meant people who had fresh takes on the streetwear aesthetic. In the beginning, he didn't think much of it. It was just a way for him to showcase his work. But even after graduating from Parsons in 2007, he kept up with it. And good thing. After graduating, he began working for a creative consulting agency, and through the agency, he met gallery owner Al Moran. Al happened to, not sure if that's the title I would have gone with, but either way, this book made waves throughout New York's art and fashion crowds. That alone was great, but here's where things took an interesting turn. Through school, Heron had made a few friends that worked in marketing type roles at Nike. When he told them about his newly published book, they told him that there was an empty space in one of Nike's New York stores, and that he could host a release party there if he wanted to. To him, this was a dream come true. This amazing opportunity had fallen into his lap, and even though he had no experience hosting events like this, he told them that he would love to. So just like that, he got to work. His inspiration for the event was high school. Although his own high school experience had been a bit unique, he found that New York City was like one big high school. In a later interview with the New York Times, he says, "I have this long-running joke that living in downtown New York felt like high school all over again. Taxis are like school buses, streets are like the hallways, and all these successful people around me are the teachers." And the reason that this theme worked so well was because his book of photographs was like a high school yearbook for New Yorkers. To drive this home, he filled the Nike store with lockers, bleachers, and whatever else he could to make it feel like a high school environment. All in all, the event was a success, and when it was over, Heron returned to his consulting agency job. But not for long. In the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, his agency was struggling to stay in business, and as a result of cost-cutting measures, he ended up getting laid off. Knowing that he could only survive in New York for so long without a job, he called the friend from Nike that helped him throw the event and asked if they were hiring. Unfortunately, they weren't. In fact, they too were laying people off, so he didn't have a chance. But a few months after making that phone call, he got a phone call back. Something had opened up and they were willing to give Heron an interview. The opening was for a marketing specialist / social media director, which Heron was perfect for. This interview was actually one of several interviews that Heron would be put through, including one at Nike's headquarters in Portland. And while they certainly put him to the test, he knew he got the job when they asked him about the most creative thing he had ever done. And he was proudly able to share that he had hosted an event sponsored by Nike. That was all they needed to hear, and that is how Heron Preston began working for Nike. So like I said, his title was technically social media director / marketing specialist, but in reality, he was Nike's ambassador to New York. How did a college kid from San Francisco become that guy? Well, I found an old YouTube comment that sums this up better than I can. Heron excelled at making his presence known. He was always out there making connections, which actually leads me to what I'd like to talk about next. You see, Almoran was not the only person to notice Heron's blog. It also caught the attention of a young, energetic streetwear fanatic named Virgil Abloh. At the time, Virgil had recently completed his master's degree in architecture at the Illinois Institute of Technology, but instead of designing buildings, he had fallen in love with designing clothes, and was working with his friend Don C. to launch a retail space called RSVP Gallery in Chicago. On top of that, Virgil was also running his own blog, mostly about the streetwear scenes in their respective cities, Heron being in New York and Virgil being in Chicago. Nothing ever really came of their messages, it was more so just a friendly back and forth, but fate had something else in mind. To pay the bills during college, Heron had taken a job at a Mexican restaurant in the city. One night, he was bringing food out to tables, just as he did every other night, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw Virgil. Both of them stopped in their tracks, realizing that it was their friend from the internet, and Virgil explained that his friend was actually the owner of the restaurant. Guess is that the interaction was sort of like the Spider-Man meme, because Virgil hadn't been expecting Heron to be working at this restaurant, and Heron hadn't expected Virgil to be in New York. Regardless, the two of them hit it off in person just as they had online, and Virgil promised to start letting Heron know when he was coming to New York. And he did. From that point forward, if Virgil was in New York, he was with Heron. If you've watched my video about the history of Virgil Abloh, you'll know that around this time, he was working closely with fellow Chicago native Kanye West. And because of their newly formed friendship, Heron was brought into that circle. The timing here was quite interesting, because 2009, the year that Heron began working for Nike, is the same year that the Nike Yeezys debuted. Heron of course had no role in designing the Nike Yeezys, but part of his job as a marketing specialist was identifying a select handful of people within the New York streetwear scene to get a pair. Pretty cool if you ask me. Anyways, going back to what I said about Heron being brought into Kanye and Virgil's circle, one thing about Kanye is that he always keeps various creatives around him to source inspiration and bounce ideas off of. Among those creatives were Virgil, as you know, as well as Matthew Williams and Justin Saunders. These are names you might be familiar with, because Matthew Williams is the current creative director at Givenchy and founder of Alix, while Justin Saunders is the founder of Jound. But back then, they were just aspiring designers and part-time DJs. Well anyways, Heron, Virgil, Matt, and Justin were all brought along as part of Kanye's entourage for the Watch the Throne tour. At different stops throughout the tour, they would go to clubs before and after shows, and each time they would work their ways into the DJ booth. Heron, whose stage name was Maserati Flames, spelled with a Z, actually had some prior experience as a DJ, and all things considered, the group was pretty good. In the beginning, they were just doing this for fun, but one night, as the four of them sat around at the Lanesborough Hotel in London, they decided to give this new collective of theirs a name, and the name they picked was Bentrill. The aesthetic was comprised of a drippy font, hashtags, and other bold graphics that you simply couldn't ignore. It was loud and unapologetic, but back then, that's what a lot of streetwear was about, and that's why it worked. In fact, Bentrill became so popular that they went on to do collabs with Travis Scott, Chief Keef, and Hood by Air. All that said, neither Heron nor any other members of the group looked at this as a long-term project. They all sort of knew that it was lightning in a bottle, and made the most of it while they could.
In fashion, of who was going to the shows that I noticed in New York City, and then you would see brands like Agnes B, such a high level that she was at. Like, that was where one of the very first like luxury street kind of relationships that I recognized when I moved to New York City was Agnes B. Then I would sneak into like the Stephen Sprouse, Louis Vuitton part and see a bunch of cool people there. So I started to see a lot of crossovers at, you know, early when I moved to New York City. Downtown, like that Louis Vuitton party was downtown on the Bowery.
Kicking off my essentials, this is actually my DJ bag. Every time I have to go and do a set, this is what I use to carry my headphones and my USB sticks. This is actually a bag that my friend Virgil designed for Louis Vuitton. Thousands of songs to just keep your nights live. With one of my first paychecks from one of my first jobs, I actually bought 2 turntables. It was Technique 1200s. And when I moved to New York, I actually started throwing real parties. So I took the practice outside of my bedroom and in my living room and took it to a road club. Next on my list of essentials is my Air Max collaboration with Nike. This concept was called Air Everywhere that we launched during Air Max Day. What if you could extend the air bubble of the shoe across the whole upper of the shoe? That's kind of the first idea that I threw at Nike, and so that's kind of what we built off of and landed on the concept of Air Everywhere. I was a big sneakerhead, posting on discussion boards like Nike Talk. And so then after that, I started actually working at Nike, and now I'm actually collaborating with them. So it's kind of come full circle. This collaboration is pretty special to me. So these are 2 upcycled bags from my brand, Heron Preston. This first bag is made from tarp that was hung up in my showroom. It's all upcycled from materials that would have literally ended up in the landfill. Second bag, it's all upcycled from decommissioned military-grade parachutes. So this is one of the backpacks that I designed in the collection, which is where you get all the color blocking from, because we got access to orange and red and white parachutes. So this really kind of speaks to, what my brand really believes in, which is sustainability and really kind of challenging, myself, but also challenging my peers to just think more consciously about how we're reducing our impact within the fashion industry. Next item on the list of my essentials is a collaboration with Levi's for 501 Day. So these are basically a customized pair of Levi's that I designed. Just really wanted to kind of play with splitting up the denim and having kind of one side be tie-dye and the other side kind of like indigo, and remixing how you would see Levi's. Being from San Francisco, Levi's being from San Francisco, and as we growing up with the brand and wearing Levi's, it's really crazy that I'm actually collaborating with them now.
Tell me about the collection that you're bringing.
The collection is kind of like a curation of pieces from my past collections that I've put out. So it's a lot of these ideas that I've bubbled up into this drop. So the flames, you'll see a lot of the graphics, like my DNA of like my brand is very graphic heavy. And so you'll see a lot of graphics, like this is the packaging tape. Like if you buy something online, like this is the packaging tape that we use. So I turn that into the ribbing. This flames is like a flames that is a skull that came out of the first collection. 24 Hour Psycho is the name of the collection. I was just like driving around New York. A lot of the inspiration of the collections and just my ideas just come from like real life, just everyday life experiences. And so I was like driving a taxi one night, and I saw this like 24-hour psychic neon sign glowing in a window, and I was just like, that would be crazy, that said psycho. And then it became like the name of the collection like the next day.
To me, that's what makes him so great. He can take his aesthetic and apply it to just about anything. That's why I'm always so excited when he releases a new collection, and it's also why so many brands are fighting for the opportunity to work with him. Following in the footsteps of his friend and mentor Virgil, Heron has emerged as one of fashion's premier collaborators. In 2018, he surprised everyone by announcing a collaboration with NASA. To me, this served as the spiritual successor of his collaboration with DSNY, because he was yet again partnering with a government organization not known for being particularly fashionable, and in doing so, was creating a collection that would capture the attention of streetwear fans everywhere. It would also capture the attention of astronomers, because in order to commemorate the launch of their capsule collection, NASA quite literally launched a mannequin wearing pieces from the collection into space. The launch was intended to highlight that the pieces not only looked cool, but because Heron followed strict NASA guidelines and used actual spacesuit material, they were also functional. Speaking of functionality, it was in that same year that Heron released a collaboration with Carhartt. One of the reasons I love this collaboration is because you could tell he had free reign to do pretty much whatever he wanted, or at the very least, that his vision aligned very closely with Carhartt's. This is evidenced by the heavy use of orange and camo, as well as his signature patches and Cyrillic writing. This is one of those collabs that just feels like it was meant to be, and that is why people went absolutely crazy for it. Even today, I'd argue that some of these pieces are among the more coveted that Heron has made throughout his entire career. 2019 would also bring some collaborations, as he partnered with Nike to release a unique fusion of Air Max 95s and Air Max 720s, as well as a football-inspired capsule collection. It goes without saying that this was a full circle moment for him. In many ways, he's always been intertwined with Nike. They sponsored his event, that's where he got his first real marketing job, and now, after all of these years, they were working together once again, and he was in the spotlight. What's really cool here is that they didn't just give him a shoe and say pick a colorway. Instead, they allowed him to work with this unique model to create something truly original, which is a sign of how much they trust him as a designer. Now, interestingly enough, this was not the only full-circle collab that Heron would have in 2019, because he would also work with Bape. As you may remember from earlier, one of Heron's earliest quote-unquote bootlegs was an Air Force One with a Bapesta logo. Well, all of these years later, he got the opportunity to do a full collection with Bape, and it included a pair of Bapestas. Not sure if it was intentional, but on the tongue of the shoes, Heron made sure to put a tag that reads, "Authentic, handle with care." I mean, how cool is that? He used to work for Nike, and after leaving, he made what were basically knockoff Bapestas, but then, in 1 year alone, he had official collaborations with both Nike and Bape. He was literally living out every streetwear fanatic's dream, and it didn't stop there. On the horizon were a few more collabs that even he may not have been expecting. For instance, he's now collabed with UGG on more than one occasion to add his flair to some of their signature silhouettes. After that, in 2021, he announced a surprising partnership with Mercedes. According to Heron, they reached out to him because of his background in upcycling. See, in order to celebrate the anniversary of the invention of the airbag, they wanted him to take real airbags used in crash tests and to turn them into runway-worthy pieces. Not only are the pieces from this collaboration astounding, but for the marketing campaign, they allowed him to reimagine one of their vehicles. I, for one, don't know much about cars, but I do know that I love this car. And this is more of an aside, but shortly before his passing in 2021, Virgil was also invited to collaborate with Mercedes. So it seems like Mercedes as a brand has been taking more and more of an interest in fashion. Anyways, while we're on the topic of Virgil, I'll mention that Heron would also collaborate with Virgil's label Off-White. Working together came naturally to these two. I mean, by this point in the story, they had already worked together several times, whether it was Bentrill, Something for Kanye, or whatever else. Part of the reason they worked so well together is because they were friends, but it was also because they had highly compatible approaches to design. In fact, you can draw a lot of parallels between Heron Preston and Off-White. There are of course many differences as well, but it's clear to see the influence that they had on one another throughout their careers. In fact, that's why I believed Heron was in line to succeed Virgil as the creative director of Off-White. To be clear, I don't know if that was ever in the cards, I never heard rumors about it, and I'm not sure if Heron would have even wanted that to happen, but in my mind, it sort of just made sense. As we now know, that didn't end up happening, but regardless, everyone was beginning to share the suspicion that Heron's talents would be called upon by some big brand other than his own. In the episode where I talk about potential candidates for the creative director of Louis Vuitton, I even threw his name into the mix. Again, not that I had any info that would lead me to believe that it would actually happen, but just because I thought he was a viable choice. We now know that that didn't end up happening either because the position went to Pharrell, but as it turns out, Heron was in fact preparing to make a big move. On September 6th of 2023, H&M announced that they and Heron had formed a long-term partnership, officially making him their creative menswear advisor. It then goes into more detail about each of those 4 pillars, but in short, it seems that Heron has been given a great deal of control over H&M's future. Although many people see H&M and think, oh, it's fast fashion, it's one of the biggest brands in the world, and it has incredibly far reach. So I'm excited to see what Heron does with that. I think what I'm most excited about is the discovery and mentorship of young creative talent. Very few people have their ear to the ground the way that he does, so this is something that I think he's going to excel at. Not even sure what the plan is for this young creative talent, but it seems like this will be his chance to empower kids that remind him of himself. Kids who have little more than a dream and the will to make it happen. At the end of the day, that to me is the Heron Preston story. Never had a grand plan of getting into this specific school and landing this specific job, or making his way to the top of this specific company. But all of that and more ended up happening because he was willing to follow his heart. I know that might sound corny, but seriously, think about it. He started making t-shirts in high school because he wanted to try it for himself. It was never about making money or growing a popular brand. It was just his way of becoming involved in an art form that he had fallen in love with. After that, during college, it was his passion project of photography that got him noticed. Not some school project, not some internship, a passion project that he did during his free time, because he couldn't picture himself doing anything else. And from there, he became more and more immersed in the world of fashion.